In the case of missing the timing and in the case of things like damage step, I think a lot of times commenters actually do know that they don't understand the ruling, and that means that they can go seek out videos or resources to further their understanding of those particular rulings. However, in the case of today's video, which is going to be about FaceDown banished cards, I would say 99% of the time people actually think they understand how it works, but when they talk about certain combos or certain interactions, they're showing that they don't actually understand how FaceDown banished cards operate. And in today's video, I want to talk about a Yu-Gi-Oh ruling you should know, and we're going to go into all different facets of FaceDown banished cards because there's a lot to cover. And I know what some people are going to say, this could just be a Pot of Desires video, but that's actually not true. There are a variety of cards outside of Pot of Desires that actually banish cards face down. Just to name a few of them, we have Evenly Matched, Eater of Millions, and even the Psy-Frame Trap can banish cards face down. Now in some of those cases, you're the one banishing your own face down cards. In some of those other cases though, like Evenly Matched, is actually your opponent banishing your face down cards. However, no matter how a card is banished face down, it always keeps these sets of rules. The first ruling, and possibly one of the most important rulings, is who can look at face down banished cards, and it's actually really straightforward, and I see a lot of people confused about this, but whoever owns the face down banished cards can look at them. Not the opponent and not both players at the same time, but whoever owns the banished cards gets to look at the banished cards. And that sounds simple, I know it does, but a lot of times people are like, man, I don't want to activate Pot of Desires in my deck because I won't know what I banished, so I won't be able to know what I can search or what I can activate from my deck. But you can look at them. However, your opponent does not get the opportunity to look at those cards. You don't have to tell them what any of those cards are, and actually I encourage you not to tell them what any of those cards are. I see sometimes people say, oh man, I banished, and then they say like a 3 of. You don't have to tell your opponent that. It is not public knowledge. Just in that, the same way you don't have to tell your opponent what's in your hand, you don't have to tell your opponent what your face downs are, you do not have to tell your opponent what your face down banished cards are, even if they're the ones that banish them. So if they evenly match your card, you can just banish the cards face down, and also they don't get flipped face up when they're banished. What I mean by that is that if your opponent activates evenly matched and you have 4 face down cards, you don't have to reveal what they were before banishing them. You just pick them up face down and put them in your banished pile face down. Another important ruling that I see a lot of people confused about is that effects do not trigger when cards are banished face down. Much like cards in the hand, the cards that are banished face down are completely unknown, even if you technically know what they are because you can look at them. So cards like Giant Rex will not activate when they are banished by Pot of Desires. The same goes for cards like Necroface, and I know it doesn't say on the card that they have to be banished face up. However, it is just a game mechanic that a card that is face down can't activate an effect unless it specifically says it can, which applies to the banished zone as well. So if you banish Giant Rex, if you banish Necroface with a card like Pot of Desires, it will not activate. Do not think that it does. Even though you can see what the card is, even though the card says it triggers when it banishes, because the card is not part of public knowledge, you cannot activate that card effect. Continuing on with that idea that face down banished cards are not public knowledge, that also means that they're not specific cards, and this matters for a couple scenarios. First off, a bunch of face down banished dinosaur monsters will not increase the attack of Tyranno Infinity because it is not public knowledge how many of them are dinosaurs. And even though technically you could reveal, quote unquote reveal, those dinosaur cards that are face down banished to your opponent to prove they are dinosaur cards, that is not how the game works. So Tyranno Infinity and similar cards that gain stats off of specific banished cards, when they are specifically, they have to be like monsters of a certain type, they will not gain attack. However, a card like Green Maju will gain attack because that one does not specify which type of cards they are that are banished, and that is a huge distinction that I see a ton of people messing up. Like, you will not believe how often people suggest using Tyranno Infinity in combination with Pot of Desires. The card does not work that way though, because both players do not have public knowledge of what those cards are. However, like I said, a card like Green Maju will gain the attack because it doesn't require you to have specific banished cards. In a similar vein, cards like Burial from a Different Dimension will not work with face-down banished cards because you can't specify if they're monsters. And even though your opponent would know that they were monsters once you put them in your graveyard, that is not how the interaction works. You cannot use a card like Burial from a Different Dimension to put back face-down banished cards. However, you can use a card like Psyframe Lord Omega and like Necroface because neither of those cards specifies which type of banished cards they are putting back. Now that I've talked about many of the rulings dealing with face-down banished cards, I want to talk a little bit about the history of why Konami even made that a mechanic. I would have put this at the beginning of this video, but I figured a lot more people would be interested in the rulings related to face-down banished cards versus the history. So anyway, when Yu-Gi-Oh! Was first created, before the term banished was around, it used to just be called removing the cards from play. I believe that many other games have similar mechanics. I think in Magic it's called exiling cards, but in the case of Yu-Gi-Oh! When the game was first announced, you had some very bad cards that just didn't really do anything except they removed cards from play. And that might sound like a game turn, but it's really not. It's not really an official term back then. It's just saying take that card and just remove it. Just remove it from play entirely, even though nowadays we look back and say, oh yeah, you just remove cards from play. No, it's literally telling the player what to do. It's not an actual term, and that's pretty important. But then they started making more and more cards related to removing cards from play, and what happened is that depending on how a card worked, the remove from play could get lost in translation. It might say, like for example, if it said remove 2 dragon type monsters that are fire attribute and more than 2,500 attack points from your graveyard from play, that's pretty wordy, and Konami didn't like that. So in the Generation 4 set, I believe, when Problem Solving Card Decks was first announced there, they added banishing instead of removing from play, which is a lot simpler. It isn't the first time that this has happened. Yu-Gi-Oh's done this a few times now. Piercing was a term they added on a little bit after that, I believe. And then we have nowadays, instead of saying graveyard on cards, it just says GY. I'm not sure if you noticed that or not, but Yu-Gi-Oh! Is trying to shorten the card text as effects become bigger and more complicated, and that's kind of why Konami made it called banishing. But in the case of banishing and in the case of remove from play, it was supposed to be a permanent form of removal, but then Konami started printing all these cards that brought those cards back into play. So the next natural step, instead of making like a double banish, is just by banishing cards face down. That is Konami's current sort of permanent way of getting rid of cards, although obviously, as I talked about in this video, it's not always permanent. There are a few ways you can get those cards back, but certainly more so when you compare it to just regular banishing. Regular banishing has tons of ways to get cards back. You have Love You're the Sea Dragon's pretty common, all sorts of like Return from a Different Dimension, Dimension Fusion, all sorts of cards that are printed that can bring back banished cards and interact with them. So then when you move to face-down banished cards, suddenly all those cards, or most of those cards, don't work anymore. So Konami can print cards like Evenly Match, and suddenly they have a much greater impact if they remove those cards from play completely banish them face down, which is really good. I mean, if you think of Evenly Match in the context of if it just sent them to the graveyard, or if it just banished them without putting them face down, it wouldn't be as good as card. But when you look at Evenly Match in the context of that it banishes them face down, well, that's a big deal. You're not getting those cards back in 99% of situations, which is when we look at Pot of Desires, sort of to wrap up this video, the reason Pot of Desires is so scary to a lot of players is because you really can't get those cards back. And pretty much every time that I make a Pot of Desires video, I get comments from people saying, oh, I just splash Pot of Desires in my deck, and then I also splash Green Module in my deck, or I also splash Necroface in my deck. I wouldn't suggest doing that. I would really try to avoid splashing those cards into your deck and just play Pot of Desires and just accept that those cards are banished forever, because what happens when you splash those cards in your deck just to combo with Pot of Desires, well, suddenly you draw those cards before you draw the Pot of Desires and you're in a really rough spot. So when I make those videos talking about Pot of Desires and talking about how it's a really good card in competitive play, I understand where people are coming from saying that it's really risky, because in some cases and in some decks, it is pretty risky. You're pretty much just throwing those cards away for the rest of the duel, which not every deck can afford. Anyway though, hopefully you guys enjoyed today's ruling discussion video as well as some history. You know, I gotta fit some history into every video. I do like Yu-Gi-Oh! History quite a bit. And yeah, FaceDown banishing really does happen quite a bit. I think most often in competitive play, you're seeing Pot of Desires and Evenly Match, but there are other cards that do it as well. And I thought I would clear up much of the confusion that I find in my own comment section. So hopefully this will help alleviate some of those issues for you guys that didn't understand how FaceDown banishing actually worked. It's not really explained in the rulebook in plain English, basically. Like, it's just sort of implied if a card is face down that it's not a monster card. I think Konami could probably do a better job at explaining it as they print more cards that actually act this way, especially considering Pot of Desires is one of the most popular spell cards in the entire game. Anyway though, thank you guys so much for watching. If you have any other questions about FaceDown banished cards, feel free to put them in the comment section below. Either I will answer them or someone else that knows stuff about FaceDown banished cards will answer them. And if you have any other ideas for this series, if it should become a series at all, please let me know as well. There could be other ruling issues that I talk about in future videos. I will see you guys later though. Thank you so much for watching. Bye.